Today, the Electoral College formalized President-elect Joe Biden's victory. 538 state electors are casting their votes for President Monday. Here's a look at the delegation from California. They were the ones who tipped Mr. Biden over the 270 votes he needed. Some electors gathered virtually this year, like one seen here in Nevada. Part of that was due to safety concerns posed by the pandemic, but also concerns over electors' personal safety. The state of Michigan provided police escorts for its 16 electors. The state capitol there also shut down over, quote, credible threats of violence. It's a procedural step that has added weight this year as President Trump refuses to concede the race. Today's vote will not be formally recorded until January 6th, when a joint session of Congress will officially record the results. A number of President Trump's backers say they will attempt to challenge the Electoral College's count. This Friday is the deadline for lawmakers to pass government funding. Last week, they approved a stopgap measure to avert a shutdown. Now, pressure to reach a deal is ramping up as Congress goes into recess at the end of next week. Key protections from the past COVID relief package are set to expire in weeks. After months of stalled negotiations, there is some movement from the White House and Capitol Hill. A bipartisan group put forward a $908 billion proposal today. It will be split into two packages in an attempt to separate some of the sticking points among lawmakers.
And I know there's an awful lot of you thought that can't be done. You surely to goodness couldn't everything agreed on and put into a bill. Well, guess what? We did. There's the bill. And
the smaller measure would offer relief to state and local governments, something many Democrats want. It would also offer liability protections for businesses to address Republicans' concerns. It leaves about $750 billion for the Paycheck Protection Program, unemployment insurance, and COVID-19 vaccine distribution. The U.S. started administering doses of Pfizer's coronavirus vaccine today. This critical care nurse in New York was one of the first to get it. Health officials are pleading with Americans to keep taking precautions. The U.S. has confirmed more than 16 million infections. The death toll now tops 300,000 people. The House is expected to vote on a COVID relief deal as early as Wednesday, but we're still waiting to hear from House Speaker Nancy Pelosi and Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell. Compromise in Congress could look different next year. The Senate balance of power hangs on the high-stakes Georgia runoff elections. Early voting in the state got underway earlier today. As you can see, the calendar is filling up, with a lot yet to be decided. The Georgia runoffs will be held on January 5th. That lands just 24 hours before Congress counts those Electoral College votes from today. Ed O'Keefe and Cailtin Huey-Burns join me now. Ed is a CBS News political correspondent, and Cailtin is our CBSN political reporter. She's in Georgia for the special Senate runoff elections. Welcome. It's great to see you both. Ed, with the electoral vote in his favor, what is ahead for President-elect Biden in the coming weeks?
Well, he's got to continue filling out his cabinet. He's only a little more than halfway there, with about another 12 or 13 seats to go. It depends on how you count it exactly. The big ones, of course, remain Attorney General, and then he's got to focus on a lot of other domestic agencies, things like who's going to be his Transportation Secretary or Interior Secretary. And these continue to be, while they may not be big deals, ultimately, they're a big deal right now because, of course, so much of the Biden coalition, so much of the Democratic Party is closely watching who exactly he's asking to serve in his government, who he thinks could survive a Senate confirmation and get through. And that is a big factor in all these decisions. Who exactly can survive a Senate confirmation if, after those Georgia elections where Cailtin is, Republicans still control the chamber? Remember, Democrats need to win both seats in Georgia in order to get to a 50-50 tie with Kamala Harris as the tiebreaker. And if that happens, Kamala Harris could very well end up being a tiebreaker on a few of these. Others are expected to get at least some Republican support. So that remains a big concern. The other one, and he's speaking to it tonight by formally acknowledging the results of the Electoral College, which we've all known for several weeks, is he's got to work on finding ways to bring the country back together. Unity, or the idea of it, the idea that he will govern as a president for all Americans, remains a big focus of his. And I will be very curious to see in the coming weeks if we start to hear a little more about how he plans to handle the first few days of his presidency, what he might say or do with his inaugural address in January, and all those other factors. But so much still rides on what Cailtin is monitoring so closely down in Georgia.
Yeah, so Cailtin, let's turn to you. You're there in Atlanta, where President-elect Biden is planning to campaign for the state's Democratic candidates in those high-stakes runoffs. What is that going to look like, Cailtin, and how critical are wins there for the Biden administration's future agenda?
Well, they're incredibly critical, and that is the message coming from the Biden team and from the Democratic candidates here. Their message basically is, look, if we are able to win these 2 Senate seats, that will help Biden's agenda actually get through Congress and, in the more immediate term, help confirm a lot of those nominees that Ed was just reporting about. But it's also central to the Republicans' message. They are framing this election as kind of the last line of defense against a Biden administration. That is kind of complicated, of course, by the president's own rhetoric when he comes to campaign here, and his rhetoric kind of every day undermining the results of the election and claiming without evidence that there's fraud. Does that kind of backfire and have an effect on not turning out the voters that they need to turn out? Runoff elections are always about your base voters, especially because they're in unconventional times. Again, we're approaching the holidays. You need to have very active people turn out and vote. But this election has really taken on a nationalized tone from both Republicans and Democrats, kind of saying, look, the stakes are extremely high, and this is going to determine the fate of the Biden agenda. For Democrats, they want that to be an affirmative case for that agenda, and for Republicans, they want to be the check on power to Biden.
Meantime, Ed, where you are in Washington, lawmakers are looking for a deal on government funding and coronavirus relief. What's the latest on those issues?
Well, they've released the details of a plan that they hope can be considered, but the fact that it's still not entirely, or really not at all endorsed by the top leaders of the House and the Senate is a sign that it's still really not going anywhere. This so far really has been an attempt by a collection of Democrats and Republicans, mostly in the Senate, to demonstrate that they're at least trying to put together some kind of deal that would provide immediate and emergency relief to people who need it. The idea being that the unemployed are perhaps the most vulnerable and the ones that need the attention. But there are still disagreements over whether or not any kind of agreement that passes before Christmas has to include what's called liability protection for companies that bring back workers to work during the pandemic, whether it has to include aid to states and cities that are in desperate need of cash in order to not only fund hospitals, but also schools, public transportation systems, and the like, and whether there's going to be some kind of a stimulus check that's sent to qualified Americans who make up to a certain amount of money, or whether relief might just go, again, to those that are most unemployed and desperate right now as the holidays approach. But basically, you have a $908 billion package that adds up to these 2 different pieces of legislation that you see here on screen. The question, again, is whether either of these get absorbed into the ongoing talks about not only some kind of emergency relief for those affected by the pandemic economically and medically, but also keeping the lights on for the government after this week's deadline. This is usually the most nail-bite-inducing time of the year for Congress, and it certainly is this year, considering that there is so much riding on it. And of course, you have leaders in both parties and both chambers threatening the possibility of either not holding a traditional Christmas break or coming back right after the holiday to finish work up until New Year's.
Finally, Ed, the president has made a number of staffing moves in his final weeks, particularly at the Pentagon. What changes has he made to the Pentagon Advisory Board? And remind us, what is that body responsible for?
Yeah, he's made a bunch of changes, Elaine, that basically put a bunch of his good friends and allies on a variety of boards and commissions that don't really have much influence over the day-to-day function of government or policy, ultimately. Various appointments to things like the Kennedy Center Board, or various commissions on scholarship programs or other things that oversee aspects of the military. But in this case, there are 3 specific sort of outside consultancy groups that are convened on behalf of the Pentagon. There's the Defense Policy Board, the Defense Business Board, and Defense Science Board. And they advise the Pentagon on just that, sort of issues of actual military policy, contracting, and then some of the more scientific or technical work that the Pentagon does. And in the case of the policy and business boards, he's managed to tuck a few people onto them. People like Corey Lewandowski onto the business board, one of his longtime allies, supporters, former campaign chief. And then today on the Defense Advisory Board, they've added former House Speaker Newt Gingrich, who of course is a longtime friend, ally, sympathizer, confidant of the president, whose wife, Callista, is ending her term as ambassador to the Vatican. Gingrich, who has been an expert on and worried about issues like the military and national security in the past, is an appointment to that board. They got rid of people like former House Majority Leader Eric Cantor, the former Secretary of State Madeleine Albright, former Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, to make room for people like Gingrich. But these are volunteer positions. Again, they're just kind of outside consultants. It's kind of the equivalent of a store bringing in a volunteer, panel of customers, perhaps, to talk about things that they could do differently. In this case, obviously, the situation, the subject of conversation, a little more serious. But no reason to believe that because Newt Gingrich is sitting on a panel that might advise Joe Biden's defense secretary, that that's going to mean some big change in military policy. It won't. This is just a way for him to reward some folks as he prepares to leave office.
All right, some important context there. Ed O'Keefe, thank you. And Cailtin, we will check in with you after a break.